Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Stephen Peinecker, and got a buddy on here. Really excited to have you back on, Jonathan. Welcome back to the program.
I'm happy to be here.
So this is Jonathan Neville. Of course, my audience knows and loves his work. He's not without controversy, but I think as people have got to know him and better understand where he's coming from, I think he's also picked up some new fans as a result of this show as well. But before we go there, I want to say a few things to my audience. Now, many of you know that I do have a production assistant named Anthony, and a personal tragedy befell him recently. Now, when he started working for my channel, he was 19 years old. He's just turned 20. He's just kind of on the cusp of starting to live his own life. And something really bad happened to him. I'll say that Anthony's had a bit of a tough life. And you know, he caught the vision for this channel early on. And the reason why this channel looks the way that it looks and sounds the way that it looks because of Anthony. And I just want to thank you, Anthony, for everything you've done for this channel. You know, early on, I was saying something about the channel. We were just starting, and he already had the vision of doing a green screen and all this, and I didn't have that vision. And I made a comment about something about cutting a corner. He said, Steve, we don't cut corners because you're Mormon Book Reviews. And we got that stands for something. And so you were an inspiration to me, man. And I also want to say that, you know, as a 19-year-old, now you're 20, kind of a hero to me. So I just want to share that. And I also want to announce to my audience that Anthony has received an internship with a film producer in California who is going to help us produce episodes now. We're going to start doing that next week. And Anthony's his internship is going to be working for this channel. And I also just want to announce that I'm promoting Anthony to producer of Mormon Book Reviews. So good job, Anthony. Really appreciate everything you're doing. Sorry, folks, didn't mean to get emotional there, and sorry to too much on the spot there, Jonathan. But just think of the book review I did last week of your Jonathan Edwards book. Look how beautiful that turned out.
Yeah, it was gorgeous. Well done.
And I just want to know,
again.
Yeah, and Anthony taught himself everything. He never has done video stuff. He designed my logo. He's helped me with the green screen. He's learning the first time he's building my website, everything. So either way, thanks again, awesome. Anthony. It really is. So I thought it was cool that everything he's done. And so I appreciate you, Anthony. So now we get on to the interview. And part of the reason why Jonathan wanted to come back on is he kind of wanted to just kind of go do an overview of events and different guests that I've had and just a lot of different things that have happened on the channel, as well as just have happened out there within the Mormon scholarship community and the Mormon studies community, and also just things that are being talked about online. And so we decided we wanted to talk. First of all, one of the things was kind of do a response to Hanna Seariac's nationalism in the Heartland Movement. And so we're going to talk about that. But since right now the hot topic and basically the only place that gave a response to the Who Killed Joseph Smith movie has been my channel. That's part of the reason why it's taken off. I just wanted to get maybe your take on it, Jonathan. What this whole you've seen the movie, you've seen both the interviews. Just kind of give me your thoughts off the top of your head.
Okay, sure. I used to practice law, and so I had lots of cases, criminal cases, and so on. And it's almost impossible to ever determine exactly what happened in history, even if it happened yesterday. You know, I've talked about this often, where you'll have a car accident. There's several witnesses. They all describe something different. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's the filters that we use when we see things, different things capture our attention, and so I understand what he was trying to do. He felt like the previous efforts to explain all the evidence were inadequate. So he sought an alternative that was maybe more explanatory. But as your interview pointed out, in the rebuttal, he overlooked a lot of evidence, for one thing. But the other problem is he approached it with an agenda in mind. And as soon as you do that, you're going to sculpt the evidence, or what I call manipulate the evidence, to fit your theory. In fact, we'll talk later about this faith model that I've got here, which kind of explains that psychology of how we assess evidence. But in this case, I think he went a little too, I don't want to say too far. He presented another hypothesis. So you know how much I appreciate having multiple working hypotheses. And I've heard alternatives to the ones he presented as well. So everybody has a theory, and you can always find some fact that kind of fits your theory. But overall, I think it was, he was a little bit too dogmatic about his own theory. He didn't really critique himself as like he did the others.
Okay, well, it's good to hear your point of view on that. Yeah, I think it was an interesting, I mean, obviously, folks, both the videos, the interviews have taken off. Kimberly Watson-Smith and Justin Griffith, both Griffin came on my program, and I was glad to be able to be that forum to have that conversation. And speaking of conversations and providing a forum and a platform, one of the things I'm really proud of with our channel is to introduce Jonathan Neville to a much larger audience. So I guess let's just kind of start with where one of the reasons I wanted to come back on was my interview with Hanna Seariac, where she talked about far-right nationalism and the Heartland Movement, which you're a part of. And I just kind of want you to maybe just tell me a little bit of some of your thoughts and reactions to that interview.
Okay, yeah, I had been fairly oblivious to this angle of attack on the Heartland stuff. What I call, most of your viewers know, I call the Mesoamerican thing M2C, for Mesoamerican Two Comoros. And the gist of their argument is that despite what we have in church history, the real Hill Cumorah, described in Mormon 6.6 in the LDS edition, is in southern Mexico, not in New York. And so they have this idea that there's two Comoras, the false one in New York and the real one down in Mexico. And the Heartland ideas, and when I say Heartland, I'm reframing that a little bit to say Cumorah-centric, as you can see on my chart here, because Heartland has acquired some baggage, partly due to the efforts of the Mesoamerican supporters, like Hanna and her peers or her friends. And so when I didn't realize how much they had been trying to link Heartland to nationalism. And she brought that out really well. And she had some good references and examples of some so-called Heartlanders who have been, and I use that term in quotes because it's not really an organization of people who sign up for anything. It's just people who have affinity for what the early church leaders taught about Cumorah. And it makes sense to us. And the Heartland nomenclature really, as I understand it, was adopted by Rod Meldrum because his idea of the geography was focused in the heartland of America. Recently President Nelson spoke in Oklahoma, or to the saints in Oklahoma and Kansas, and referred to them as the heartland. That's a common term for that part of the United States. And so the idea of the heartland scenario, model, however you want to frame it, is that Cumorah is in New York, and therefore the rest of the Book of Mormon took place somewhat in a limited geography focused on New York. So the Mesoamerican theory was originally developed in the early 1900s. The first M2C map really was published in 1917, I think it was, by an RLDS scholar named L.E. Hills. And then his theory was that Cumorah was in southern Mexico, just like the BYU people teach us today. And so over time, that theory has acquired more credibility to the point where it's the dominant theory. It's embedded in the logo of Book of Mormon Central, for example, and Farms. And all the Fair Mormon material is all geared towards defending the M2C idea and attacking the New York Cumorah. And so I thought, okay, if we're talking about the evidence, then we have all the church history, we have the teachings of the prophets, and then we have the extrinsic evidence consisting of archaeology, anthropology, geography, and all the sciences. And if you do a side-by-side comparison of those, which I've done many times, then people can see that and make their own choice. And I think that the Mesoamerican people recognize the weakness of their position, because basically they're saying that Joseph and Oliver misled everybody, and all the other prophets have misled everybody. And so for them, an effective technique to attack the Heartland idea is to invoke this nationalism idea. And that's the idea that some of the people who accept the Heartland also are, let's say, right-wing or conservative. Politically, they focus on America as the most important country, things like, the nationalistic ideas that Hanna expressed. And I was oblivious to that, frankly, because when I got into this, politics had nothing to do with it. And she pointed out that I've spoken at Heartland events where there's been other conservative speakers. And I said, well, we've also, at that conference, I've also shared a stage with people who talk about the Mesoamerican theory. It's not, and there's a wide spectrum of political beliefs there as well. And so I never really identified myself as with the nationalistic ideology, okay? And besides, I know people from all political views and non-Americans who couldn't care less about American politics, who all embrace the New York Cumorah. So this was, I think they've been trying to make a link there to discredit the Heartland idea, not because of what the prophets have said, not because of the evidence, not because of the text, but solely to link it to something that they find politically distasteful that they can criticize. So it's really a straw man argument in my view.
So it's very, I just want to point out a couple of things too, folks. At the Firm Foundation events, Rod Meldrum has also had evangelicals speak at his group.
Yeah.
There's actually been elected officials and other folks that have talked to his event as well. So it's not like it's that far out of the mainstream. But,
as soon as you mentioned that, it reminded, there's far more diversity at Firm Foundation events than there is at any of the Mesoamerican stuff. And they won't even have me come speak because I'm not a Mesoamerican proponent. And they won't have anyone who disagrees with their orthodoxy about Mesoamerica. And so if you anyone looking for diversity, you can't go to the Book of Mormon Central, Fair Mormon, the Interpreter, that crowd, because they all say the same thing and they're adamant about promoting their idea.
Well, and Thomas Murphy even pointed out in his critique of Rod, he also made a point to say that, kudos to the Firm Foundation for hearing and listening to Native American voices where they come on and speak.
That's right. They do.
And we don't have that necessarily happening too much with the Firm Foundation. So this is, it's not as black and white as people might think it is. And speaking of the Firm Foundation, just to let my audience know that I've been in touch with Rod, and I gave him a proposal of a presentation I'd like to give to his group, and he seems interested, so stay tuned.
Yeah.
But I also just wanted to talk about, so one of the points of this program is to try to build bridges, and not burn them, but build them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that has been very helpful is getting people to sit down with each other that normally wouldn't sit down and talk to each other. Like that Thomas Murphy and Rod Meldrum are going to have lunch one day. That I know.
Yeah.
And so I think what behind the scenes, I just want to point out that I've been in touch with Hanna, and I've been in touch with Jonathan, and I guess last week you and Hanna had a 2-hour telephone conversation with each other.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, my attitude is I'm happy to talk to anybody. I'm a lot like you, although I'm not as forthcoming in terms of doing interviews. And so kudos to you again for doing all this. And if I lived in Utah, it'd be different because I could go have lunch with people, but I'm hardly ever in Utah. So, but I enjoy everybody's perspective. I really like learning from other people, whether it's Thomas Murphy or Dan Vogel or John Dehlin or Brant Gardner or anybody. And so for me, having a dialogue is more important than trying to win any points. So Hanna is awesome. She's very smart, obviously. She's fairly up to date on issues and so on. And I enjoyed the conversation quite a bit. I think some of the conclusions or the things that she has presented were a result of her not communicating with people. and relying on blogs and things like that instead of having a conversation. And at the same time, I told her I appreciated what she'd done, because I've had, since she's brought these issues to my attention more, I've been telling Heartlanders, look, you guys should never be mixing politics and religion. It's a bad combination. And all it does is when you link politics and religion that way, anyone who has a different political view rejects the religious view, even though it should be considered independently. You know, even when I moved here to Oregon, I had some people in Utah tell me they couldn't believe I would move to a blue state, for example. You know, and to me, none of the states are red or blue. They're all basically green and blue because they have trees and water. You know, so I just, the people in Oregon are awesome. It doesn't matter what your politics are. Humans are humans. You know, and you can be great people regardless of your politics. And the other thing is, detaching politics and religion helps us assess each one on its own merits. And that's where I think the M2C people have made a big mistake, because they're trying to link Heartland to politics to prevent people from looking at the Heartland on its own merits. I was in a meeting once, I won't get into the details, with some M2Cers, and we were talking about having a side-by-side comparison. Let's just put the facts out there. All the facts should be on the table, and then we can have our different hypotheses or interpretations, as we'll talk about in this faith model in a minute. And they didn't want to do it because they said, well, if we did that, most Latter-day Saints would go with the Heartland stuff. And I think that's true. I think most people would. So I have to acknowledge their persuasion tactic being successful, trying to link the Heartland to nationalism, but I hope people aren't misled by that. It's a false connection. I mean, sure, you can find evidence of it because everybody expresses political views, but there's plenty of evidence that it goes far beyond nationalism. It has nothing to do with nationalism originally anyway.
So yeah, I'm glad, again, you guys were able to have that conversation with each other. We'll see where that goes. Maybe we'll do something down the road together.
And just so you know, I'm happy to have conversations with anybody you have on your show. Because every one you've done so far has been really interesting. Oh. And I've met several, like Chris Thomas. You put me together with Chris Thomas too, and he's fantastic. Yeah. We had a really good time. So
yeah, it is great to know these conversations are happening that wouldn't otherwise happen. So I did have a quick question, because I want us to talk about maybe also your reaction to some of what Dan Vogel had to say, and we can maybe open this up a little bit and go back and forth on a few things. One of the questions I had for you was, I'm trying to remember if this was on my 2.5-hour interview with Dan Vogel, or this is part of my 3-hour off-the-record conversation I had with Dan Vogel. So I think it's in the interview. But basically, he comments that around 1831 or so, there was a newspaper man who recorded that Oliver Cowdery said that the landing spot of Lehi's party was in Chile. Okay, can you maybe just give me your reaction to that?
Well, first off, it's hard to tell. I don't remember that exact reference. I'd have to look at it again. But newspaper reporters, there are several instances where they would hear different things, different rumors or whatever, and put them in the report. And it's, as I recall, it wasn't a direct quotation that something Oliver Cowdery said. It was his characterization of what he claimed Oliver and his associates said. And so, it's a pretty thin reed to hang that whole thing on. And it's the whole issue with what was his name, Frederick G. Williams' notation about the 30 degrees. Mm-hmm. And when I look at that, I thought, well, what are some possible explanations? What are multiple working hypotheses? And what if, for example, Joseph said Lehi landed at 30 degrees latitude, and then they assumed from that he was talking about in the south, 30 degrees south. But what if he was talking about 30 degrees north? Then Lehi would have landed in the Florida area, which is roughly the same latitude as Jerusalem. And then often you'll see in history and even witness testimony today and so on, people will hear one fact and then they'll infer other facts and report the inferences as facts. And I think that's a lot of that stone in the hat stuff consists of that type of evidence as well. But in this case, I'm thinking they made a point of 30 degrees latitude. Now, if that's all Joseph said, and then they inferred the rest, that would explain how they could come up with this Chilean hypothesis. But even when Orson Pratt did the footnotes in the Book of Mormon, and he mentioned Chile as the landing spot of Lehi, he didn't say it as a fact. He said something like, it is believed that, or, you know, we suppose that, words to that effect. I have the book here somewhere if we want to look it up. Whereas when he talked about New York Cumorah, he didn't say it's suppose that. He says Cumorah is in Manchester, New York. That was considered a fact. And Oliver Cowdery had established that as a fact. And so when you compare what Oliver wrote in letter 7 and letter 8, where he's clearly explained that it was a fact that the Hill Cumorah of Mormon 6:6, where the final battles were in the repositories in New York, versus you know, a speculative or uncertain newspaper article from Ohio in 1831, those are completely different levels of credibility in terms of evidence. Now, the other thing is, I'd say that even, let's say the newspaper reporter had accurately reported that, but Oliver never said it publicly. He didn't put it in any of those 8 historical letters. And so it's possible that he had heard something Frederick G. Williams had come up with, you know, and then later realized that it didn't make sense. So he didn't put it in when he talked about Book of Mormon geography in letter 7.
Okay, yeah, I just thought I thought it was important to address that point that he made.
I'm glad you brought that up though, because I love Dan Vogel's research. You know, I have several of his books, Early Mormon Documents, and he's done an amazing job on this research, better than anybody else that I know of, really.
Yeah.
And the Joseph Smith Papers frequently refers to things that he's found, you know. So I give him kudos for all that.
Yeah, I think he's rendered an invaluable service to early Mormonism. That's that area is the most fascinating area of history as well. And so I've been reading Vogel for a very, very long time, and really do appreciate your work, Dan, and everything you do. So let's see here. Well, you were
did you want to talk about Thomas Murphy too?
Yeah, I want you to talk about Thomas Murphy, and also Rod Meldrum's presentation. We could touch based on that, because I want to talk maybe a little about young Earth creationism and stuff too that we could talk about. But let's go with Thomas Murphy. Now, Thomas really was a fantastic guest, because he took rather than dismiss the Heartland model, he actually took it seriously. Now, you may not like his conclusions, but he took the time to read the books, do the research, find some merit in some of the research, and have a conversation, which I think is so important. So it actually, if anything, it kind of brought the Heartlanders now a little bit more, people are taking it a little more seriously, because Thomas Murphy's taking it seriously. So maybe just kind of give me your impressions of Thomas's presentation and where he was coming from.
Well, as I understand it, he basically was referring to the 2 things, really. One was my Jonathan Edwards work. He pointed out how, which I pointed out also, but he agreed that Jonathan Edwards was a missionary to the Indians and was attempting to convert the Indians. And it was, I'm trying to remember the guy's name. He did the Journal of the Missionary to the Indians. I can't believe I read this book all the time. I can't remember his name, but so there was a long history, of course, of trying to convert the Indians to Christianity and the Native Americans there, particularly in New York. And in fact, I've pointed out too that Edward's son was, he sent his son to be a missionary to the Indians, and his son went and lived with the Indians, learned their language. And it was all along the Susquehanna River, interestingly, not far from Harmony. And that's where we get into what the head of the river means and so on. But there was a lot of discussion about the Native Americans and Christianity before Joseph Smith came along. Edwards died in, I think it was 1758 or 7. And so it was, 60 years before Joseph was even born that Edwards had written all this stuff. And so as Thomas Murphy brought out, these ideas about how would we create a Christian community for Native Americans, what would it look like, and so on, was pretty well known, as well as the theories about their origins as being the lost tribes of Israel. So in Thomas's idea is that when Joseph came along, he kind of adopted or embraced the prevailing theories and came up with the Book of Mormon as a narrative. And that's kind of what Dan Vogel thinks too, as I understand it. He wrote his first book, as I recall, was the Native American Origins of the Book of Mormon. Okay, so I look at that and I say, yeah, okay, we were all looking at the same facts. What are possible interpretations? Theirs is definitely a working hypothesis that they embrace, and a lot of other people do. I look at that and I say, well, there's a key factor here that the Book of Mormon explains that otherwise we don't have explanations for, and that is kind of the pre-European times. If you go back further in history, before the Europeans arrived, the ancient civilizations in North America were the Adena and the Hopewell, two different ones. Joseph Smith's time, no one had distinguished between those. Both of those civilizations left no writing that we know of, and yet they left sophisticated earthworks. In fact, I didn't mean to bring this up, but I have this nearby. I have this book by Squires and Davis that shows a lot of the earthworks in North America. And I don't know if people are familiar with these, but a lot of these are very sophisticated and mathematically oriented. You can see, here's a few of them. These are all in Ohio, or mostly in Ohio. And when you look at that, you think, well, it's pretty hard to imagine that they didn't have some kind of writing to be able to communicate over these long distances and so on. So the Book of Mormon, in my view, is really a history of these people. And the way Joseph interpreted it was according to his own language. And so instead of having the Book of Mormon as a result of the European, maybe I could draw it up on here and show you, but instead of it being a result of European interference or incursion, let's say, into America, the Book of Mormon goes earlier than that and relates the narrative of the people that were here before the Europeans ever came. And so I understand where Dan and Thomas are coming from on this. It makes sense, but I think the exact same facts support the narrative that Joseph Smith gave. The other thing I think is, I mean, we could talk about this. We didn't spend a whole session on it, but another interesting thing about the mound builder theory is the mound builder theory that Dan talks about is not what's in the Book of Mormon. And Oliver Cowdery in his letter 7, again, made a clear distinction. He said it was not that the wicked killed the righteous. It's that the wicked killed the wicked. And I think that was partly him addressing the mound builder theory. You know, it's interesting too that in the late 1800s, one of the primary critical books, the anti-Mormon books, said that the Book of Mormon could not have taken place in North America because we know there is only one ancient civilization in North America. The Book of Mormon says there were two. And that's what led L.E. Hills and Stebbins to create the Mesoamerican Two Comoros theory. But after the 1900s, after that book was published, is when archaeologists started recognizing there were actually two ancient civilizations. The Adena were older and the Hopewell were less old, which correspond to the timeframes in the Book of Mormon. So that it's ironic that the main criticism of the Book of Mormon in the 1900s was that the Book of Mormon described something that science hadn't discovered. And then in the 1900s, they did discover what the Book of Mormon claimed all along. So really what I see Dan and Thomas doing is looking at it a little too narrowly. They're not considering how the Book of Mormon describes those pre-European early North Americans. And that's a discussion we could have another time, but that's just how I look at it.
Well, one of the things Thomas mentioned was, because I brought that up, like, okay, what about this idea that the dates of the Adena roughly follow the Jaredites and the Hopewell? And he says there is not a distinction. He said that they're
Right.
both, they're the same people.
Yeah.
Maybe speak to that.
Well, I know he said that, and this brings up another fascinating thing. We could do a whole session on the Jaredites probably, because the Book of Mormon distinguishes between them, but only because Moroni said that he was giving a history of the people in this North Country. He started off by saying that, and because Oliver Cowdery explained when Moroni came, he told Joseph that the book was written and deposited not far from his house, which to me means Mormon and Moroni lived not far from Joseph's house. And so when Moroni was talking about this North Country, that's what he was talking about, the New York region. That doesn't mean it excluded all the other Jaredites. In fact, when I think of Jaredites, you have Jared and his brother, and then their friends, right? And the Book of Ether is only a record of Ether's ancestors. And if you go out 33 generations, that's a pretty small little fragment of the entire society. And so the people who think the Olmecs, for example, were Jaredites, I'm totally good with that. That makes sense, because I think they arrived up in the Vancouver area in British Columbia, and there's a Native American tribe that has a tradition that fits. And I've talked about all this before. And then they spread out throughout the land. And it explains why there's Asian DNA throughout the Americas, because they crossed Asia to get here. And there's a lot more to it. But I think what Thomas Murphy's getting at is they were the same people in a sense, but they were different enough to be distinguished. They had different types of mounds that they built. They had different cultural practices. And the record of the Adena is fairly, it's not as detailed as it is of the Hopewell, because they're more ancient. And a lot of the Hopewell built on top of Adena structures and so on. But the Book of Mormon doesn't say they were two people. In fact, lots of scholars have pointed out that the Book of Mormon names after the people of Mosiah joined with the people of Zarahemla, all of a sudden these Jaredite type names start popping up. And so there was a distinct culture, but also indication that they were combined as well. And so when I look at that, I think, okay, it is clear that the Adena were here long before the Hopewell. We know from the dating. It's also apparent from, and Thomas Murphy would know this better than I do, that Adena culture kind of merged into Hopewell culture, but not completely. They were still distinct. And that's how the Book of Mormon describes it.
And just to reference Hugh Nibley, Hugh Nibley proposed essentially that the Jaredites were probably Asiatic in their background. And also Hugh Nibley made that point about how there's these Jaredite names that start appearing into the narrative, most notably with some of the antichrists, if you will, of the Book of Mormon. So it almost seems like, because that was like one of the biggest, weakest points about the Heartland model, is that you have these, yes, you have the Hopewell, and yes, you have the Adena, but there's also overlap that they would have known about each other. It would have been impossible. Yeah, so that answers that question, I guess, if you will, that they knew of these people, and they did finally include their history into the record. But it sounds to me, just the very nature of the Book of Ether is that it is just an overall summary. It's very short, obviously. It doesn't, but it's covering a lot of period of time. And so it obviously seems to indicate that there was a lot more to, obviously, the civilization within the context of this world, that they would have had a lot more to say. Their history.
Yeah, I mean, just think of a family tree. Ether relates his genealogy going back 33 plus generations, right? He knows exactly who, in two places he says was a descendant of, so that genealogy is a little vague in those spots. But for the most part, he can trace his genealogy all the way back. If you go the other way and start at the top with the brother of Jared and branch out, you've got an enormous branch of family throughout, and that doesn't even include their friends, right? So the idea that all the Jaredites, everybody, all the descendants of everybody who came on those boats with Jared and his brother were killed at Cumorah, I mean, the text doesn't even suggest or imply, much less state that. A lot of people bring up this idea, and I think the M2C guys have adopted this idea too, that there were 2 million people killed at Cumorah. But that's not what the text says at all. In fact, it has Corey Anthony talks about 2 million of my people were killed. That was several years before Cumorah. And when I read it, to me, it's like he's thinking about his entire genealogy, going back 33 generations. And he could see, and Ether had prophesied this would happen, but he could see how the things that Ether was prophesying had happened throughout his history. It's like when we say how many Americans have died in war. We don't just think of the Iraq War. We go all the way back to the Civil War, or even the Revolutionary War, or even the Indian Wars before that. So that's, and that makes the whole more sense, because when you look at I guess I'm digressing back to this Cumorah-centric idea. But when you read Ether, and he talks about the final battle of the Jaredites, he said he gives us the last 3 days how many people were killed, right? And I did a little spreadsheet going back for the whole week, and it was under 10,000 people. And it's very interesting that when Oliver Cowdery wrote Letter 7, and he talked about the Jaredites, he said there were thousands. He didn't even say tens of thousands for the Jaredites. And that's what the text says. And that makes all the sense in the world to me, that it was Ether's line. By the time they got to Cumorah, there were less than 10,000 of them, and they killed each other off.
So I don't know if I should bring this name up, but I'm going to. So a few years ago, I came across a video of Dan Peterson giving a presentation on the Book of Ether in Italy, I believe. So I was really excited. I'm like, all right, I'm going to get me some Book of Ether knowledge here, and I'm going to really have a better understanding of the book. And I came away from the presentation not knowing much more about the Book of Ether than going into it. And I just want to say, and I'm not bashing you, Dan, but please tell me more, but more than what you gave in that presentation. Well,
what can they say? I mean, they've been on record saying that it had to be 2 million people or this massive army. That's why they're looking for a huge mountain in southern Mexico. Mm-hmm. It's called the hill Cumorah. It's not called the Mount Cumorah, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, Oliver Cowdery knew all these issues. He knew about the mound builder myth. He knew about the number of people who could have died in that valley, and he addressed all that early on. Mm-hmm. And so it's just amazing to me that here we are, what is this, almost 200 years after Oliver Cowdery answered all these questions, people are rediscovering it, I guess. And that's what leads to the Heartland idea.
You know, it's interesting because when I read Mark Twain's account of his dissection of the Book of Mormon, essentially, it's actually a dissection of the Book of Ether.
Yeah.
I always found that interesting. It seemed like somebody must have just read this one chapter, you get the gist of it.
Yeah,
you know, so he didn't really engage the text that well.
No.
So I wanted to just back up a little bit because I find, because I have you here, and these are questions I've always been wanting to ask believers and defenders of the Book of Mormon. And so I'm always curious to get your perspective on things. And that is, to you believe that the Jaredites landed around Vancouver. Are you assuming that they kind of hugged the coast, basically just followed the coastline? And do you and it just also describe to me the barges, what you think how they function?
Well, I'm not a shipbuilder or anything. Okay. I know when I was up in Vancouver, a friend of mine was in the public affairs up there, and he told me that some missionaries had contacted an Indian tribe up in British Columbia, and they reported their origin narrative was that their ancestors arrived in clam-shaped boats that were tight like a dish even, and inside they had glowing pearls. And I said, what? I've never heard of this. And so he actually emailed me photos of their journals where they wrote what these Indians had told them, okay? The First Nation people up in British Columbia. So of course I like to see for myself, right? So I went up there to British Columbia, and there's a museum there in Vancouver, and they have a sculpture depicting this narrative. And it's kind of a clamshell opening, and these guys are crawling out of it with the raven there. And so, and I've talked about this before, but to me, that is at least analogous to these barges that the Book of Ether talks about. And you know how myths are created, and they're based on some facts sometimes, and then they're interpreted for mystical or instructional reasons and so on. But this narrative really appealed to me. So then I thought, well, I live here on the Oregon coast, and when there was a tsunami in Japan, there was a dock that floated all the way from Japan, landed up here north of us a little ways. And it took 300 and some days to get here, which is roughly what the Jaredites took. And so when I look at that, I think, okay, if they left from China, which a lot of people think it's a little bit farther than Japan, not that much farther, but the time is about right to just be drifting over here. And as I read the Book of Ether, it implies more of a drifting kind of a scenario than sailing, for sure. And that fits with the currents and what we observe today. So for me, that all makes sense. I mean, I can't, the description of the barges in the Book of Ether, as I read it, is Joseph Smith trying to explain what the text said. He probably couldn't figure it out either. So he did a fairly literal translation, but you know.
I mean, and when you think that whether this is a something to bolster or to criticize the Book of Mormon, he uses the term barges, which is what they were used. They're all over the place with the Erie Canal. So that would mean, okay, let me think, barges, right?
Yeah. Well, something that transport people and goods, it's a barge.
Yep.
And plus, don't forget, it was Moroni's translation of the original that he had to translate. So it's a second iteration at minimum of what the original actually said. So yeah, I mean, we could do a whole session on the translation, which I don't think we've done that yet. But
well, hey, we got time here, so I love having you and to be able to ask these questions is really awesome. I wanted, was there anything else about Murphy and Dan Vogel that you wanted to
well, I appreciate them recognizing that only the quote unquote Heartlanders are the only ones that still believe what the prophets have taught about Cumorah. Which is really kind of amazing when you think about it. It was taught for 150, 180 years. It originated with the first presidency in 1835, or actually before then, but it was formalized in 1835. Oliver Cowdery was the assistant president of the church. He was the designated spokesman to teach all these things. Joseph Smith had it copied into his journal as part of his life history. He had it republished in every Mormon newspaper during his lifetime, all those things we've talked about. So it was so well established. And even, the M2C guys up here, they all talk about these 1842 Times and Seasons articles about Central America. Those articles don't say anything about Cumorah. So, I mean, even if you want to accept those articles, it doesn't revoke what was clearly and definitively taught about Cumorah. So as I look at all this, you have, can you make sense of the New York Cumorah or not? I mean, let's say there was literally no way to make any sense of the New York Cumorah, that it had to be a false teaching. Then that undermines the credibility of everything Joseph and Oliver taught. But if there is a way to corroborate with science, with the same facts that Dan and Thomas Murphy relate, you can use those same facts and corroborate what the prophets taught, then that's the way I go. I just don't understand the mentality of trying to tell people, whether it's the youth in the church or whether it's non-LDS people, that Joseph and Oliver told the truth about everything except for Cumorah and the translation. On those two, they misled everybody. Well, then the whole thing kind of implodes, right? They were either honest, accurate, forthright about everything, or they weren't. So I prefer to believe, based on the evidence, that they were honest and forthright and accurate, told the truth.
So one of the things that I find interesting is that the first presidency, as recently as 1990, issued a statement that they believed that the events of the Book of Mormon took place, the final battle took place at Cumorah. Now, what's so fascinating to me is it's the critics of the church, like Radio Free Mormon and Bill Reel, that are showing, wait a second, guys, why do you deny this letter? And they're trying to say there's this other letter that's out there that's never existed, apparently.
Yeah.
But before, I just want to touch base on that.
Let's come back to that, because I can tell you an update on that too.
Okay, but before we do that, I just want to say one thing. I know that this channel may appear to be Heartland centric with guests and stuff like that. Now, of course, I've had Thomas Murphy on, I've had Dan Vogel on, but I also feel it's important that faithful LDS or restorationists who advocate the Mesoamerican model, I have extended invitations to them. I have one individual who's in the process of writing a book, and then he's kind of mapping the Book of Mormon. And essentially, I've asked him to come on because he believes in the Mesoamerican model, and he's expressed interest in coming on. So I just want to know, I'm going to have a really good expert come
Awesome.
on. So I'm excited about that. So, but he's still writing the book, but we'll probably be talking to him soon. So let's talk about that letter in 1990. Well, give me the update on that.
Well, I don't know how much I can say yet, because I don't know if it's been released publicly or not. So let me just do this. If you read the letter, it doesn't state a position. All it does is state a fact. In fact, I don't have the letter here in front of me, but it points out that there was a long history of teaching that Cumorah was in New York. I mean, it started with the first presidency in 1835, it has never been revoked. And so how that letter became controversial, I have no idea. Because I mean, the history is there. I mean, as much as the Joseph Smith Papers tries to hide the history because of the way they're editing the notes and stuff in the Joseph Smith Papers, and as much as the people at Book of Mormon Central try to pretend the history doesn't exist, the history is there. You know, here's an example, Book of Mormon Central. Okay, when I first wrote my little book, Letter 7, I gave it to them to put on their webpage for free. And they had it on there for maybe a year or two. And finally they took it down because they said too many people were looking at it. And to me, that's just an example of outright censorship. They don't want people to know the church history. And so all that little letter did in 1990, I mean, it was the most innocuous letter conceivable. It didn't do anything other than state what the history everybody can see. So of course, the guys down at Farms at the time, as I recall, freaked out because they didn't want to have a reaffirmation of the New York Cumorah. Now, ironically, it was in, I think, 1975 was when Marion G. Romney, who was a counselor in the first presidency, gave a talk specifically about Cumorah. He had just been there for the pageant. He said from the top of this hill, he was looking over where the final battles were and all that stuff. So there's a member of the first presidency as recently as 1975 talking about it. I think Mark E. Peterson talked about it in a few conferences after that. There's nothing controversial about the letter until these guys tried to. So they had a fax. Well, RFM talked about it on the show. So anybody can go see that whole episode. He had 2 episodes and they were fantastic. All he did was state the facts. And there will be an update in the next, maybe by the time this is put out, it'll be public and I can give you a link to put on. But there is one new development along those lines, and it reaffirms what RFM was saying, which was that Dan Peterson made up that other letter, or at least William Hamblin, whichever one of them did it. They just made up this subsequent letter that never existed. All there was a fax that reordered some of the statements from the Encyclopedia of Mormonism and that whole history. I mean, I've blogged about this, lots of people know about it. So but it is evidence of how desperate they are to dissociate or to discredit the teachings of the prophets about Cumorah. I mean, it's just unbelievable to me. But,
so
I mean, I'm happy with people believing whatever they want. Don't get me wrong. But, yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the presentation that Rod Meldrum did. And I want to thank Rod so much for coming on, because Rod, I mean, I've been a fanboy of yours for a long time. I really love you.
Yeah, Rod's awesome.
And it was a real honor for him to come on my program. Now, one of the things that was interesting to me is that I actually heard back from Thomas Murphy, Dan Vogel, I believe Simon Southerton, and one other prominent person, who were all very surprised at how Rod Meldrum tied in young Earth creationism as much as he did with the Heartland model. That was the reaction I got from a lot of people. Like, I'm surprised he did that, and I just wanted to maybe discuss Rod's interview, presentation. Great guy, love him, and maybe some of your ideas that might be a little bit different than Rod's.
Well, you know, I'm one of these guys who, I wasn't there when the Earth was created. I don't have any personal knowledge of any of this. And so I understand the young Earth arguments. I've been to even the museum there in near Cincinnati, you know, in Kentucky.
Creation Museum.
Creation Museum, the Ark. I've been through all that stuff. I've been through all the scientific, in the museums on evolution and so on. Even the Bean Museum at BYU shows how evolution works, you know. So I've seen all the different perspectives. For a while, a few years ago, I did kind of a deep dive into all this. And I finally reached the conclusion that it's kind of like my faith model that we'll get to, hopefully. It's you start off with what you believe, and then you find evidence to justify it. That's all it boils down to. And so even for Thomas Murphy or Simon Southerton, they have a set of assumptions that they just accept, and that's fine. And Rod has a set of assumptions that he accepts, and that's fine. And they argue which one is the correct assumption, right? And I think certainly the scientific community, we could say, and it's form, which it really, but scientists agree with the, how would you say, other than the young Earth, there's a lot of different theories about how the Earth was created. It's not really a dichotomy, but let's say there's the young Earth, there's maybe medium range Earth, and then there's the Big Bang, 4 billion years ago.
Well, and you have, like, for instance, you have Hugh Ross, who's an old Earth creationist, astrophysicist from Toronto.
Okay.
And so he can use the same evidence and use the same timeline of the universe. And then you have like the intelligent design folk up at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, essentially an evangelical, although there's a little bit of influence from the Moonies Church, the Unification Church. It has some involvement with that as well. So you have those, if you will, multiple working hypotheses as well.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think that.
Well, and even outside the Western tradition, you have an Islamic approach.
Yep.
You have a Hindu approach.
And Hindu, it's trillions of years.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, and nobody that I know personally was there when it was created. So we're all taking facts that we have available to us, which are a microcosm of reality, right? But we can access a few facts, and then we develop theories that explain the facts according to our own beliefs. That's all it boils down to. And anyone who says, well, they follow the facts, well, they're deluding themselves, because their facts don't exist. There's no objective fact that exists without our interpretation. It's like the idea that does a tree fall in the forest if there's no one there to hear it, right? Facts don't exist in a vacuum. I mean, even space isn't technically a vacuum. So anytime I hear someone's theory about how the Earth was created, I say, well, what are your assumptions? And then they'll tell me. And, for the scientific method to work, you have to be able to consider multiple working hypotheses until you can exclude some. And as far as I've seen, no one's excluded any of these hypotheses. Some people rely on scripture as the most important. Other people rely on, let's say, radiometric dating or, the various methodologies. But they're all based on different assumptions. So I guess I don't want to say I'm I'm agnostic. Maybe that is the word, because I can't say from my own personal experience what happened. And when I did the deep dive, I realized it's all based on what you want to believe.
So one of the things to me when I was talking to Rod Meldrum is like that something can't come from nothing. Of course, something is an idea that he does not care for. Now, of course, as a Christian, we have the concept of creation ex nihilo.
Right.
And if anything, the Big Bang Theory essentially gives us creation ex nihilo. One of the reasons why, first of all, it was called a Big Bang Theory, it was Hoyle used that term derisively, because many of the scientists believed in what was called a steady state theory of the universe. And so they did not like the idea of a Big Bang because they said it sounds much too like the big opening chapter of Genesis. Yeah. So to me, the Big Bang, even though the young Earth creationists don't like it, it's like, dudes, I mean, this was like, we beat them. We beat them.
Yeah, well, that's an example. Yeah, I know. And then you have all this whole idea of cosmology is fascinating.
Yeah. Well, and it is fascinating because, like, for tomorrow, I'm going to be interviewing Tarek Lacour, and he's a materialist. And part of the reason why he's a materialist, part of the reason he converted to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is because he did not accept the idea of a non-corporeal God. So that's what appealed to him. And I also recognize that I can look at those same Hebrew scriptures and make the argument that is God as organizer as opposed to creator if we look at the Jewish text. So multiple working hypotheses. I'm willing to look at all of them. Yeah. So I just wanted to share that.
See, this is what my basic philosophy is. People can believe whatever they want, and they will believe whatever they want, and evidence doesn't really matter. And that's why, for me, this issue of Cumorah, I keep coming back to this. And I've had several of these scholars down at BYU ask me, why do you keep talking about Cumorah? And the reason I do is because if the Book of Mormon is the keystone of our religion, Cumorah is the keystone of the Book of Mormon. Because without that historicity, that's why Oliver Cowdery recognized this was so critical. He was responding to the Mormonism Unveiled book, which said that Mormonism Unveiled talked about the stone in the hat, the Sith stuff, but they also had this Spalding theory that Joseph was just reading a novel, right? That it was all fiction. That's why Oliver Cowdery recognized that in order to defeat the argument that it was fiction, he had to ground it in the fact of Cumorah. And he knew because he'd been in the repository himself there. So for me, the Cumorah is, as I say, the keystone of the Book of Mormon, because without Cumorah being accurate, the Book of Mormon could literally have taken place anywhere or nowhere. So I keep coming back to that, and that's a materialistic approach, I guess. But once you have Cumorah and it makes sense and you can explain it, then from a materialistic standpoint, the whole narrative makes sense. So as far as cosmology, though, I'm happy for people to believe whatever they want. I mean, I hate to say I don't have an opinion, because I kind of do, but it's not really grounded in my own experience.
Yeah,
and
got it.
A lot of these things, when even the PhD experts disagree about stuff, how are we going to make a decision that's informed? We can't. And you have PhDs, creationists as well. So,
Yeah, so it's interesting. I had a good Catholic friend of mine last summer took his family to the Noah's Ark Museum, Catholic, and they don't really have much of a creationist background. He was curious. I like people that are willing to think outside the box.
Have you been to the Ark?
I'm going to get there eventually, I'm sure. Okay. Somehow, some way.
It's pretty funny, because when I was there, it happened to be kind of an off season or something. I had the place to myself, basically. There were maybe 30 people there. So I when you normally go, it's like a Disneyland ride. There's a long wait, and you go through, and you can have. So I was able to just walk around at leisure, take pictures of the whole thing and everything. When you first walk in, they talk about the creation, and they emphasize how polygamy is evil. It didn't make any sense, other than I took that, of course, as a kind of anti-Mormon thing. But how does that fit in? I was wondering to myself, because Genesis doesn't talk about it really, at least the first part. So anyway, it was pretty funny. And there are a few other little digs at Mormonism throughout, but and I take those with a grain of salt. That's all good. But I still appreciated the work that they've done. I think they've made some plausible cases.
Okay, so well, I think it's cool. You went and visited them and interacted with them. Did you, by chance, like when talk to any of staff and say, "Hey, I'm a Mormon, by the way," or have any kind of conversations?
No, I didn't do that. It's almost like going down to BYU and saying you're a Heartlander. You just invite reactionism, because they have such a visceral reaction. You can't really talk to them once you admit you're a Heartlander or you admit you're a Mormon. You just can't have a dialogue.
If I go to BYU and say I'm a Christian, they'll flock to me. So it's kind of interesting.
Well, that's because that's like, that's politically correct now, right? To embrace the Christians,
yeah. Okay.
which I've been doing for a long time, but now it's cool,
Now it's cool to do it. That's right. You were cool before it was cool. Just remember that. So, real quick, I was wondering, so right there on your whiteboard there, I see Jonathan Edwards, and I want to talk about that. And I think maybe we could tie this in with the idea of Sith, a stone in the hat. So one of the things that I found so fascinating about your work, and of course I've done the book review. Everybody knows I love Jonathan Edwards and the work that Jonathan Edwards Neville did to make this fantastic book, Infinite Goodness. And I just felt like you really, when you first told me about the book while you were still working on it last spring, I was so fascinated about it that we actually kind of taped a preview of the book, and then I had you on to talk about the book. And and what I like about your approach is that you take the approach that you're going to use all the scholarship that's out there, but then and then actually not only just use the scholarship, but then contribute to the scholarship because of your work, very unique work of finding that Jonathan Edwards seems to find its way throughout the book. And so it's a fascinating thing, because basically you're saying that Joseph Smith was a conventional translator, as opposed to somebody that was an automatic writer, if you will, or was just reading off something off of a stone. I just have a quick question for you. One of the things that has been brought up to me is that, well, and actually, let's just talk. I'm working on this book too, folks. Visions in the Seer Stone, and I'm going to have Bill Davis on, and so we're going to talk about.
Yeah, I read that one.
Okay, cool. And but also one of the things is the idea that a lot of Joseph didn't have to read Jonathan Edwards because all the pastors were using Jonathan Edwards phraseologies and terms as well. Maybe speak to that a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, well, as I told you, when I got into this, I was just interested in the non-biblical language in the Book of Mormon. I hadn't even thought of Jonathan Edwards. And I'd read, there's several people who have talked about parallels between the Book of Mormon and various Christian authors. You have the late war and you have View of the Hebrews, but beyond that, other people have noticed Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, and others who had similar phraseology to some aspects of the Book of Mormon. So I was familiar with that. In fact, there's a database, I can't remember who did it, but one of the Mormon book collectors has a CD or a DVD with a list of similar terms and so on. But when I was going through it, I kept coming up with Jonathan Edwards, and I couldn't figure out why that would be until I found that his book was on sale in the Palmyra bookstore that I chose to visit. And since then, in fact, just the other day, I came across a whole bunch more Edwards stuff in the Book of Mormon. But I thought, certainly he could have heard it in sermons. But think about the likelihood of that. First off, it's hard to remember everything you hear in a sermon. You hear a few words. You don't hear these long phrases and memorize them. At least that's unlikely. That's why I think him reading made more sense. Plus, when he said, as I pointed out in that book, is when someone asked him about the restoration, he started at a young age when he was 6 or 7, right? He had his leg surgery. He was laid up for 3 years. He's not sitting around listening to Christian sermons, but he's reading Christian books. That's all there was to read, and the newspaper, or the magazines and Christian magazines and so on. And so when I did this analysis, I deliberately limited it to what was available to him that we can show, which was what was in the bookstore in Palmyra. Now, I know other people, Michael Quinn and others, surveyed the entire Western New York to find if there is a book on magic in Rochester, that kind of stuff. And none of that is plausible to me because they weren't traveling to those distances. He would go to Manchester and Palmyra, and that was about it. And so, but these were books available right in that bookstore, and where he was described as being an inquisitive lounger. That's the word they used for him because he was hanging out there all the time. And so when I limited my analysis to the books, I have that whole list of books. I've digitized most of them so I could do word searches. And other than James Hervey, which I mentioned in the book, everything was linked to Jonathan Edwards. Now, obviously, the ministers were quoting Edwards. Other Christian writers would refer to Edwards or use the same terminology, but it was always originated with Edwards for the most part. So that's why I settled on that. And the other thing is, we can't really tell how often he was going to hear Christian sermons, because he talked to the one Methodist minister after he had the vision, but he didn't. After that, he was kind of turned off by it. You remember the account when his mother invited him to come to church, and he said, "Look, I can learn more with the Bible in 2 hours in the woods than I can learn 2 years going to your church." So that's an indication that he was not going to church. He was reading and studying. And that comes out in the text. But it isn't only the text of the Book of Mormon. It's the early revelations and the Doctrine and Covenants and his personal writings. It's all the same. I've annotated all that. And it's all full of Edwards' imagery, Edwards' concepts even. In fact, the notable thing for me, or almost a surprising thing, was how much Edwards talked about America being preserved for the restoration of the gospel in the latter days. And he had debates with, I don't remember who it was, the Isaac Watts, I guess, about this, because Isaac Watts thought England was the best. Edwards was saying, no, America is the best. And so they were having some debates about that. But Edwards really was influential, but he was also, he was like the Elias for the restoration, as I put it. So I know critics are saying, well, I didn't come up with anything new because we've known that there's an influence. Well, no one is, if someone else had done this, I wouldn't have done it. But no one has really looked at it in the amount of detail that I have. And I've annotated entire chapters of the Book of Mormon. And it's all King James or Edwards. And there's a few that are innovative, that I haven't found in other sources. There's another database called the Evans database of early American writing that's in the Word Cruncher program. And you can find a lot of these same words and phrases scattered throughout that, but only in Edwards are they all there. And I think it's cool, you know, saying that marriage to his wife. And people say, well, then if I've actually had some LDS critics say that now I'm saying Joseph Smith composed it based on Edwards. But as you pointed out earlier, I think he translated it. And any translator, you can't determine whether someone translated something or composed it unless they tell you what they did, because they're going to use the same syntax either way. And that's why I think all the evidence of composition is also evidence of translation.
You just broke up briefly. One of the things that Jonathan was referring to is that how he believes that Jonathan Edwards believed in eternal marriage. So I just wanted to clarify, because you broke up slightly.
Okay.
Maybe they wouldn't have picked that up.
Yeah, thank you.
So, you know, that's what I've found so intriguing was this premise, is that that he would influence the text. To me, your idea of this happening, well, first of all, like I've mentioned this before, as an evangelical, I like the fact that Jonathan Edwards is in the Book of Mormon. Now, some people have said, well, it was the same spirit that Jonathan Edwards had, that was the same spirit that Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon have, and that it's not that he was copying, like, for instance, this person believes that he was reading off the stone. He said those words were coming up because it was the same spirit or the same ideas. Maybe just address that.
That's possible. Again, I wasn't there, right? And so, but what I look at is when he said translate, does that mean reading off a stone? I mean, every Bible at the beginning says translated from the original Greek and, you know, in Hebrew. And so everyone knew what a translation was. They knew that the King James was a translation. The idea of a translation was not foreign or unusual at all in anywhere in English culture, you know, because of the King James Bible. So when Joseph said translate, at least when he was doing the Book of Mormon, it seems to me that that's what he would have had in mind. Plus, he specifically said he copied the characters and translated the characters. That's not seeing him in a stone in the hat. If he was reading off a stone in the hat, why copy him? You know, it's interesting that the Book of Mormon mentions that the interpreters would magnify the words. And in that sense, it's almost like a magnifying glass. And maybe, or Orson Pratt said the engravings were very fine, maybe difficult to read even. And so when Joseph said he copied them, I assumed he enlarged them to make them bigger, and then he could start to learn them. We don't know anything about the vocabulary. We have the characters document. We don't even know if that's legit, you know, and so on. But by him saying he copied the characters and translated them, that tells me he was engaging the characters on the text. And then, you know, others said he looked on the plates when he was doing the translation. It's not just reading words off a stone in the hat, in my view. Now, you know, my theory about that was that he was doing a demonstration. And I think that's pretty evident, because even later on in life, when people would ask him for a revelation, he would recite something to them, and they say, no, we want you to use the stone. And he'd say, okay. So he'd say the same thing and look at a stone. And that tells me that that's all that stone was. It was for the benefit of his audience, let's say, or his followers, not that something that he needed. And so when he did the demonstration in the Whitmer home, it was that same idea. They wanted to know. Remember, the girl was, maybe I'm going too far upstream on this translation stuff, but it gets to your question about the stone in the hat stuff and Jonathan Edwards. I mean, sure, possibly the stone in the hat recited Jonathan Edwards. And I call that the mysterious, incognito, supernatural translator, the mist, because who put the words on the stone? You know, some people say it was Wesley, or maybe Moroni had learned 1500s English and he translated. I mean, there's all these theories that to me are a little crazy, but there are multiple working hypotheses. But the simplest thing, you know, the Occam's razor approach is that Joseph Smith did what he said. He learned the characters and then he translated them. Obviously through inspiration, because any translator gets a variety of possibilities in their mind. They have to choose one, and that's where the inspiration comes in.
Mm.
But that's how I see it. It's an Occam's razor deal.
Mm. What do you say to people where there's accounts that the plates were not often? As a matter of fact, from what I've read, is that according to some of the sources I've seen, is that, and this seems to be the dominant narrative that I'm familiar with, is that most of the time the plates weren't even in the room when he was doing the translation.
Yeah, okay. I don't know where the most of the time comes from.
Okay.
I know that when I look at all those, I wrote a whole book about all the witnesses. And when I look at it, I say, okay, is the witness telling us what they physically observed or what they heard? And what they physically observed, how much of that is what they observed and what they inferred? So for example, let's say we're in the room, they set up the demonstration in the Whitmer home. Joseph comes downstairs, he's got a stone, puts it in the hat and starts dictating words. If I'm watching that, I could describe just that. Joseph Smith came downstairs, put a stone in a hat and dictated words. That's a factual statement. If I say Joseph was translating the Book of Mormon, that's my inference, because I don't know what he's doing. All I can say he's doing is putting a stone in a hat and dictating words. As soon as I say what he was seeing on the stone, or even when I say he was dictating the Book of Mormon, that's an inference. If I say he was translating, that's an inference, because translation is a mental process, right? And that's why this book you just mentioned, the stone, Vision in a Stone, whatever it was.
Visions in a Seer Stone. Yeah.
Visions in a Seer Stone. That's a plausible scenario, because yeah, he could have memorized it. He could have been reciting a narrative that he had the highlights down like an outline. That's all possible. And that's consistent with him, people observing him dictating from reading in Stone in the Hat. But I was curious about something. So I thought, well, all these people sitting around the table watching him dictate, what did he actually dictate? And nobody kept a record of that. There's no chain of custody from that demonstration to the text we have today. He could have been reciting the alphabet for all we know. Now, somebody probably would have mentioned that, but nobody wrote down, oh yeah, I was there when he, dictated page 37 of the Book of Mormon or something. There's no link between that demonstration and the text that we have. Now, my own theory is that he was dictating Isaiah from memory. And I explained all that before. I think that explains the minor discrepancies in the second Nephi from the King James Version. And there's about 4 or 5 chapters in particular, I think he was dictating on that occasion from memory. But that's just my hypothesis. Nobody documented it. So whenever someone says the plates weren't even present, then I think, okay, were they at a room where he was actually dictating the text of the Book of Mormon when the plates weren't present? And there's nobody saying anything like that. Nobody has, and this is, as frustrating as a lawyer, you wish you'd have been there, you could have cross-examined some of these people, because their testimonies are just, would be so easy to cross-examine. I would say, okay, David, just a minute. Tell me, how many days were you present? Because he said I wasn't there most of the time, right? Most of the time they translated upstairs, but I was present on this occasion when we had 3 scribes and they took turns and we were all sitting around the table. That's the one he always refers back to. And I would say, is there another occasion when you were present or just that one? And if he said, well, only that one, then I'd say, okay, now what did Joseph dictate on that occasion? See, these are the kind of questions that we'd have to have. Otherwise, we're just shooting in the dark. And so someone could say, and several of these are much later, of course, but I think they were people trying to build faith by relating what they'd heard as if it was a fact. It's just like today. I mean, I just saw a video of Brad Wilcox demonstrating the stone in the hat as if it was fact, but Brad Wilcox wasn't there. And yet someone listening to him would think he was relating a personal experience because he states it as a fact. Now, that's been my criticism of Ruststone Rolling. And throughout the book, Richard wrote things as if they were a fact when they were just an interpretation of the facts. Historians always do that. I probably do that myself. I try to always say, well, here's a possibility, here's what I think happened or something. But because you can't state as a fact something that you weren't a witness of. And that's what most of these testimonies about the Book of Mormon consist of.
So, yeah, I want to thank you for just the work that you did with the Jonathan Edwards book, because I just think you kind of opened up some avenues there that people need to ponder and explore. So kudos to you for that. Is there, before we kind of move on, is there anything that we've covered so far that you want to go back to, that you wanted to cover, or do you feel like we're covering this pretty good?
I think it's enough. We've been going for a long time
All right,
already.
great. So I guess one of the things that's sitting behind that board behind us is you have the name Dehlin back there. Now,
Right.
my viewers are probably sitting there like, okay, when is he going to get to Dehlin? See, this was actually a pretty good tease you came up here. I like what you did.
Yeah.
Maybe just bring up why you have John Dehlin's name written on that whiteboard.
Well, I put it on there partly because we've talked about him, you and I have, and he's so he's frequently a topic of discussion on YouTube videos, right? Plus, he does a lot of YouTube videos himself, and I've listened to many of them. And so he established himself as kind of I don't know, almost the head of a movement, really, with his Thrive conferences and so on. And so I've been interested in what he's done, and I don't know him personally. I've tried to meet him, and he hasn't responded, and so on. But I don't, he's entitled to do his own thing. When I watch it, though, I feel like he's very adept at converting normal human problems into blaming the LDS Church, and it's like I've had other discussions with former LDS people about various topics. And it's a common thing for them to blame the church for things. And one of the examples is the suicides in Utah. When in particular, I have a friend who was blaming the church for all these suicides. And I thought, well, is suicide unique to Utah? That'd be my first question, just looking at it analytically. And suicide is actually a worldwide phenomenon in every culture, And so if I was living in Mauritius and there were suicides, then they might blame, let's say, the Hindus or a political party. Or people are always trying to assign blame to things. But suicide is a very complex topic, and there's physiological elements as well as psychological as well as cultural, right? So to try to isolate one blame and assign it to that, the way I'm only using suicide as an example. I'm not saying John's doing this with that topic, although I think he has. To say it's caused by the LDS Church, to me, is just creating a narrative for some ulterior motive. And a lot of times he has people on who have had trouble with in their marriages or in interpersonal relationships or at work or even working for the church, whatever, which are common human experiences throughout the world and throughout history. But he comes across as if it's all the cause of the LDS Church. And that it's effective, it's persuasive, I guess, because people were listening to it. But I feel like it's somewhat predatory for him to be doing that and to eliciting that kind of a narrative. And so, but that's fine. I mean, I could totally be wrong about that. I'm just saying this is my impression from watching his interviews. I feel like he's manipulating people and he tries to make a big point. It's almost like he protests too much in a lot of the times. And what he says now, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but blah, 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 then he'll put words in their mouth, And so like he did that a lot. Well, I don't want to get into specific interviews, but so, and then the other side of it, I see in my view, getting back to the Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards was anticipating and hoping for and trying to bring about the spread of Christianity throughout the world, and to try to bring to pass the long foretold prophecies about how the knowledge of Christ would be found throughout the world, which the Book of Mormon also talks about, of course. But the purpose for that is to establish Zion, to create a perfect society where people can realize their full potential, love one another, everything be positive, right? and that's what the church is doing at an accelerating pace. And I wrote a little novel called Before the World Finds Out. I don't know if you've ever seen that one. But the idea is that there's all this stuff going on that the world doesn't even know about that the church is doing that's awesome. Like the pathway program for education, the initiatives for self-reliance and so forth. I mean, the church is teaching people how to correct logical thinking errors. It's in the curriculum. And I've been teaching these classes myself on logical. Those are the kind of things that can change society and change the world, even if they're not LDS. Just those initiatives that only the church is doing that I am aware of is providing this kind of education on a low to no cost basis to everyone in the world. And so, and it's mentored, there's always missionaries involved with this. So it's not just people reading stuff on the internet, there's interaction, they're teaching one another and so on. And John Dehlin is kind of undermining all that effort, all that positivity. And he protests that he's not, but he is, and he knows he is, and his viewers know he is. And so I would say that I'd be happy to have this discussion with John at some point. And I think the other thing about him that I think is ironic, he relies a lot on Sith, right? He says Sith is one of the main reasons people leave the church. He says Rough Stone Rolling's one of the main reasons, and Von Brody's book. And the whole thing about the lack of evidence for the Book of Mormon and all that, that's based on the M2C stuff, because I don't think many people take the Mayan connection very credibly outside of the M2C bubble. And so John uses all those, but and to his credit, he's using the words of the LDS scholars. And that's where I disagree with both him and the scholars. But I have Sith, Dehlin, I could put Dan Peterson and Jack Welch, all those guys all teach the same things about the Book of Mormon and about the translation. I disagree with all of them on it. And that's why I guess I put Dehlin on there as sort of a place marker, so we could have a little bit of a discussion about what is going on with the quote unquote anti-Mormon narrative. I don't like that term either, because I don't think it's a legitimate term. I think it's an apologist term that is,
I agree.
It's just pejorative. It doesn't really contribute anything.
Well, it is, because I think, and I just want to, this is where our worlds come together. I grew up basically reading anti-Mormon literature, and there's a lot of garbage out there and a lot of propaganda, but probably some of the most important anti-Mormon scholars were the Tanners, who were just documenting the history of the church and making it available to BYU professors. The church was not making it available to them. And I just want to say that when you call the Tanners anti-Mormon, that is a slur, because they never ever. There's a story that I want to tell, but I don't know if I can tell you yet, because I think it's going to be in Sandra's book, and she's told me this story that early on, when the Tanners started interacting with the Christian churches, he had some interesting conversations with the clergy, let's just put it that way. But basically, the Tanners didn't have an anti-Mormon Mormon bone in their body. They loved the people of the church, and they just wanted the people to know the history of that church. I'm sorry, I'm going to step off my soapbox now, but I just wanted to share that, because I think it's important that when we have these conversations, we need to think outside of these boxes and all these things that have been put between us, and realize that when Sandra Tanner was given a place of honor at the Mormon History Association this past June, when she was there for the Murder Among the Mormons Forum, that really kind of shows now the place where the Tanners belonged all along.
I can give you an analogy. When I was young, I was afraid of the Russians. I thought the Russians were going to come and kill us and everything, right? And then I think it was when I was in college, I met the first Russian in my life. Now you have to realize I was living in Germany. I went to scout camp. I was 8 miles from the border of Czechoslovakia when the Russians invaded Czechoslovakia.
Wow.
And we were listening on our radios because we were afraid they were going to come and get us, And so I was terrified of the Russians my whole life. I've been to West Berlin. We had to go through East Germany. We couldn't get off the train, and you get there and there's Checkpoint Charlie. So I grew up with that whole narrative. which anyone born in the last 20 or 30 years can't even imagine, because that hasn't existed. So I grew up with this fear of Russians. I met a Russian, perfectly nice guy. And then since then I've gone to Russia and done business and stuff, and I got to know Russians quite well. And in Moscow, they have this sculpture. Well, it's not a sculpture, it's an actual ICBM pointed towards the United States. And it doesn't have any fuel in it, but it shows that was the history. And I said, why were you guys trying to nuke us? And they said, we weren't trying to nuke you, you were trying to nuke us, And so it was this whole false narrative, really, of the two sides threatening each other and getting their populations agitated. And that's kind of what the LDS apologists have been doing. They've been making LDS people afraid to look at church history because they say it's all anti-Mormon stuff. And the Tanners have been awesome. In fact, they were one of the ones. Sandra has a link on her page about the Hill Cumorah. And she points out right there, all the prophets have taught the Cumorahs in New York, but your scholars say it's not. Who do you believe, your prophets or your scholars, And she's right, totally right on the money on that. And so, my own view of church history is that the more I learn about it, the better it is. The more it confirms my bias, let's say. But seriously, I think the more I learned about the translation or about the language of the Book of Mormon, the more it corroborates what Joseph and Oliver said all along. And I think the Tanners, to their credit, did a lot of good bringing out that information that's only made things better. What's happened is, though, there's a lot of narratives that were developed, like the Stone of the Hat narrative, that are undermining people's faith, because who wants to believe that the Book of Mormon came from basically the equivalent of a crystal ball? The whole narrative is a soothsayer. I call it a soothsayer, but it's the same idea. Okay, I'm not saying it didn't happen because I wasn't there. If people want to believe in the Book of Mormon that it came from a crystal ball, fine. To me, it doesn't make sense, and it's not what Joseph and Oliver said. So anyway, that's why I think Dehlin came up as just kind of a plug-in for that whole area of Mormon discussion about the history and these other issues.
And actually, folks, I just want to say, for those of you who want to see a really interesting graphic novel called The Glass Looker by Mark Elwood, he illustrates the myth and folklore as well of Joseph's time. So it's an interesting thing because it is giving you a narrative. Now, I liken it to, there were early stories about the apostles that were going around that are apocryphal. It's kind of in that same vein. Some of it's true, some of it's not. It's kind of an interesting approach that he takes. So I just want to mention, check out my interview with Mark. The Glass Looker is an interesting publication to check out as well. This has been a really cool conversation we're having here. I think we're about 90 minutes in, and I'm loving every minute of it. I think it's important that we get into the acronym. We have written there, the faith model. And I want you to kind of break that down for us.
I'm going to erase this and spell it out so we have it easier.
Great, let's do it. Okay, I'm ready to be taught here. I love this. All right, folks, there goes our outline. Yeah. Fortunately, I have it written down on my pad in case I need to go back to it, so it's all good.
Well, you have it on video too now.
Of course, yeah, of course.
Okay. So, can we see that okay? All right.
Yep.
So for a long time now, I've been pondering what causes people to have faith. Because if you look at a world map of religion, it seems like it's all regional, for the most part regional, right? Yep. So Muslims live in their countries, Hindus live in theirs, Buddhists, Christians, even the different Christian denominations. You have Catholic and Protestant, and it's almost geographical, which means that it's a tradition, right? It's hereditary, basically. Yep. And then you have a few people who convert from one thing to another. People convert to Christianity from, say, Buddhism, whatever. There's a kind of an aura of conversion going on. You can almost think of it as the protons in an atom spinning around, always moving. But the core is the nucleus of the atom, and that's the religious people. So I thought, well, what causes people to have these beliefs, and yet they can all be either well-educated or completely uneducated, and it almost doesn't matter, you know? And so I thought of this analysis, and I thought I'd use FAITH as the acronym because that's easy to remember, but it also fits. So the first thing is you start with facts. And facts are something everybody can agree on, you know, the distance of the sun from the earth, whatever. And in our case, I'll use the analogy of one that I've written in my the manuscript I'm working on. When Lucy Mack Smith said that when Moroni came, he told Joseph Smith there were plates in the hill of Cumorah. According to Lucy, that's what he said the very first time he met Joseph Smith. Okay, so I'm going to use that as my example here. So okay, that's Lucy Mack Smith. Everybody can agree that she dictated that in her history because we can all read it in the Joseph Smith papers.
So just real quick, a lot of people use the criticism. Well, that was written years later, a long time ago.
Yeah,
One thing
go ahead.
But I just want to make an observation is that she didn't say Hill Cumorah.
Right.
She said Hill of Cumorah. In other words, she's not using the terminology that was understood at the time. I think that's an interesting thing.
Yeah, although it was in the land of Cumorah.
That's fine. But I think
yeah.
Hill Cumorah comes off. That was the in other words, she's maybe remembering something that predates the term.
Oh, well, it would have predated the Book of Mormon for sure.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, so but everybody in the world, regardless of your religion, can agree that that's a fact that she dictated that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a fact. That's what I mean. Then you have assumptions. People make assumptions about the facts. So I'll go through the whole thing before I apply it to the Hill of Cumorah, but just to start off with, you can assume that she told the truth, that she lied, or that she was misinformed, right? It's all an assumption. And from the assumption, then you go to the inferences, or interpretations. And this is where you start saying, okay, here's a fact, here's what I assume, and here's how I kind of support my assumptions, right? The next one is what I call threading or weaving. Where you take all any other extrinsic elements and weave them into a narrative. And then you end up with your hypothesis. Your narrative. And the funny thing is here, your hypothesis is basically your assumption. Okay, so you just there's another way of showing how you confirm your bias, but I wanted to break it out a little bit more to see the different elements that go into it. And so just starting with this Hill of Cumorah, when I look at that, I assume, okay, Lucy's telling the truth. I mean, she was Joseph's mother. She specifically said she wanted to relate things that he had never written down, but that she remembered. And she had related this account many times to the point where she was exhausted from relating it, so she wanted it recorded. Okay, so for me, that's a very credible source. Even if it was in 1844, which was 20 years after the fact, a mother tends to remember things that her son tells, especially something like this, right? So I give her the benefit of the doubt. My assumption is that she's correct.
Jonathan, just to say, my mom tells me stories from my childhood I don't remember.
Yeah.
And things that I said, even at a relatively old age. So that's a good point.
Yeah. And then, but you have other people who will say, no, she was wrong. She incorporated a later, false tradition. That's the MTC people. Mm-hmm. Then you have other people that say, no, it was all made up anyway. Even if Joseph said that, it was all a hallucination or a fantasy or something. So people make their assumptions just when they read that. They don't have to go any farther than just reading those words in the document and they make an assumption. Then they go to the inferences. And because I infer that she was telling the truth and I interpret what she said to make sense, then I find all the other evidence that corroborates that and I thread it together. And then that leads to my hypothesis that the Hilkmore is really in New York. The M2C people will say, well, she's lying. And the reason is they infer that it was because she misremembered or adopted a later theory. And then they thread in all their stuff about it's too far from Central America and so on. And so it confirms their bias that she was incorrect. And then someone who doesn't believe anything about LDS say, for even if she was, it was Joseph's hallucination, and here's all the evidence that he was, making it up or reading, seer stone and so on. So I like this faith approach because it lets me isolate different arguments that people make. And I can say, okay, if you're saying that Lucy Mack Smith was telling a lie or misremembering because of articles in the 1842 Times and Seasons, that's not, that is purely confirming your assumption up here. It's not a legitimate analysis. And that's why I like this approach. I use it all the time now, and I'm explaining it more in my book that I'm doing. I have a book coming out called The Rational Restoration. And
I love it.
I'm kind of applying the almost a materialistic approach, naturalistic approach to all this stuff and showing, hey, you don't have to rely on magical thinking to explain all this stuff. Sure, there's some magical thinking in the sense that an angel, a resurrected being, appears to somebody.
Mm-hmm.
That's magical thinking. But Moroni didn't do the translation. Moroni didn't go to the printer, Joseph did all of that. And Oliver helped him. I think, by the way, there was a lot of interaction between Joseph and Oliver when they were doing the text. I think Joseph said, well, how about if I do it this way? And Oliver said, well, I don't understand that. I think there was a little bit of that going on. That's why you see so often it says, or in other words, which was another Edwardsian thing he used all the time. Anyway, so that's my approach to this.
I think that's great that you're giving us like the framework of what you use to when you encounter a fact or an idea, that you're going to use that to break it down. I think that's very helpful. I find that very interesting. One of the things I want to talk about too, which I find interesting, is that so often people describe the process of reading from the stone, and then the word would not disappear until they got the correct spelling down. Now, on my way from the Joseph Smith Papers Project, I'm going to be getting the photos of all the original pages from the Book of Mormon, and from the handwritten. And one of the things that people will tell you is that the handwritten account is full of spelling errors, and that Grandin had to make a ton of corrections.
Yep.
So to me, it's like that. The initial forensic document that we have, to me, disproves that, and this is just my opinion, because I'm open. I really want to, but the initial evidence discredits the means of describing the process of the translation using the stone. Yeah,
it does, and Royal Scousins pointed that out too. He said, I don't know what they're talking about, because not only is there misspelling, and misspelling is hard to really assess because there wasn't a standardized spelling as much.
Correct.
But there's different spellings. So the same word is spelled different ways. So if the idea that Joseph was correcting everybody, what I suspect happened is on one occasion, at one time, Joseph had someone read back or whatever, and he corrected them. Or maybe he was doing a translation and he felt like, I better make sure they spelled that right, And then that became lore. That became a narrative. They said, oh, he always was correcting the spelling. It was miraculous. When it actually maybe never happened, or if it did, it happened once or twice. And all of a sudden that becomes always. Because you're right, the original manuscript shows lots of spelling discrepancies and not a lot of corrections of spelling.
So I just find these conversations with you really, truly fascinating, Jonathan. I want to thank you for taking your time. I want to thank you for taking your time and I hit the wrong
Sure.
button there for a second, to do this with me. It's always fascinating just to have original thinkers like you. So like I tell people, I want to talk to interesting people. I don't want to hear just the standard narrative rehashed to me. I just want to hear people that have different approaches and different ideas, and creative ways of telling their story and giving their presentations. Now, sometimes, obviously, folks, Jonathan has ruffled feathers. I know there's a few people out there that like to write about him a lot, and I've read some of your stuff, just so you know. But actually, there's two people that kind of write about you a lot, and I want to say there's one guy who's a student at BYU who I've talked to. He's not the main, he's not the big guy that goes after. He's one of, but he's a cool dude. He's a student at BYU. I actually had him on a Zoom call because he kind of wrote a piece about you and I said, hey, we got to talk because you got to make some corrections on this. And boy, 45 minutes later after that Zoom call, you made those corrections. So props to you, dude. And I just want to say there are good people that we can disagree on things and we can have civil conversations. We can build bridges. I can look at your arguments that you made today and as an evangelical, take something from it that's valuable. And it's not convoluted. When somebody tries to explain to me that no, the academic position is that words appeared on the stone.
Yeah.
That I have a hard time.
Yeah.
I have a hard time with that, right? And so I think yours is more naturalistic. Yours is less, like you said, less supernatural. And it also puts Joseph there in the room, engaging the text. And I really think that just seems to ring true to me. So that's just my opinion.
It's funny to me because even that the 1834 book Mormonism Unveiled pointed out how ridiculous the stone in the hat idea is. And they said, okay, some people say he used this seer stone in a hat. Other people say he used the Urim and Thummim, but in neither case he was using the plates. And if that's the case, then who cares whether the witnesses saw the plates or not, if he wasn't using them. So that's a pretty good point. Yeah. And that's what Oliver Cowdery was addressing when he wrote those letters. And now to have this all kind of come back again, but not only come back, but be embraced by the LDS intellectuals, it's just stunning to me.
And I had a conversation with Richard Bushman, and I actually gave a theological apologetic defense in favor of the seer stones with him. So I'm telling you that I also think that one can make an apologetic defense in favor of the seer stones.
Definitely
too.
could.
And so I think that's where I'm at too. I just really like to look at all the ideas and the positions that are out there, and as an outsider, then try to integrate it and try to come up with ideas in my, like, how do I think it happened? Using your faith model or a variation of that. And I think that's just a kind of a cool experiment that's going on here. This channel is an experiment. I mean, this is uncharted.
Awesome. I love what you're doing. and it's like I pointed out, in some of my slides, I've shown all these people going in the temple, and some of them might believe M2C, Heartland, that the Book of Mormon is a pious fiction. Doesn't really, none of this stuff matters what you believe if you're doing good and building Zion, right? And what you're doing to me is building Zion. I was going to do a book called Zion Without Us and show how the whole world is collaborating to build Zion without the LDS Church, because we kind of lost that ideal for a while, got more into these internecine wars and stuff. And what you're doing is building Zion, not within the LDS Church as an organization, but you're contributing to unity and harmony and people recognizing what's important and what isn't important. And all these issues that I talk about on our list here today, they're important in the sense that people may build faith on them or on alternatives. And the utility of faith in the modern world is to help build Zion, to become more Christ-like and to unite people. That's what it's all about. And so I'm not trying to cause any division. I'm not trying to persuade anybody of anything. I'm just trying to say, here's how I see it. I'm happy if the guy I work at the cannery with believes in Mesoamerica, that's fine with me. The thing that I resist is when people pronounce these, what I consider unbelievable narratives, like the Mesoamerican thing. To me, that's unbelievable. And the stone and hat is not believable to me. But I'm fine if people believe it. I just don't want to be told you have to believe that. And that's where I fault the LDS scholars, because they're intransigent. They will only present their own point of view. And like you're presenting a variety of points of view, that's what Book of Mormon Central should have, a podcast just like this, and they refuse to do it because their whole obsession is that they think they have the answer, and they are trying to promulgate it. They're spending millions of dollars every year promoting this Mesoamerican stuff, which excludes people who see through it, or I should say who don't accept it. And seeing through it is a little pejorative, but they don't accept it. People like me don't accept that. So for me, Book of Mormon Central is a negative, despite the good stuff that they have. So I think what you're doing, you're setting an example for the LDS scholars to broaden their horizons, to acknowledge that they don't have all the answers, and they should be amenable to alternative points of view. Now, I would agree that they should limit it to alternative faithful points of view. I'm not saying they should have John Dehlin featured on Book of Mormon Central, but they should have other people who interpret the same evidence in a faithful way that disagree with the scholarly conclusions. That's all I've advocated. That's what I was telling Hanna, getting back to that conversation. Because I said, you should have people, Heartlanders, so to speak, although let's call them Cumorah-centric. They should speak at all the Book of Mormon Central events as well as the Meso people. It's just not a legitimate academic exercise, and it's even a less legitimate religious exercise to insist on one doctrinaire interpretation of the evidence. So, but again, and I can't say it enough. I mean, what you're doing is awesome. You're providing people opportunity to hear for themselves what other people think, and they can accept or reject or embrace or whatever they want to do with it. But at least they know how other people are understanding the same evidence and what their ulterior motives are. Mine is for unity and harmony throughout the world. Mm. I've lived in China and Africa and all these other places. So anyway.
Yeah, it's so interesting because that's one of the things that really struck me was early on, the idea of like Zion or the Zionic imperative, or just different terminologies using the term Zion. And I tell my Christian friends that, the restorationist idea of Zion would be similar to our view of the millennium. But what I find interesting about the Zionic idea is that you're a participant in building something.
Right.
And I think that there's something that in that all of humanity in one sense could be part of the building up of something that could also help bring us to a better place, like within the context of whether it's a second coming or building a better society, whatever level you want to put it on. And I often I've been contemplating the idea of Zion and as understood within the concept of restoration. And I actually think that's something we could probably learn from you guys. I think that maybe we could integrate that idea.
You don't need to learn it from us. You just need to help us do it.
Okay.
You don't need to join any church. This is what I say about the Book of Mormon. Nobody has to join a church to love the Book of Mormon, right?
Right.
Nobody has to join any church to build Zion. Mm-hmm. It's a process of education, recognizing logical fallacies, but having a desire to benefit humanity. One of the things that I most like about what President Nelson has been teaching, when he came to Singapore a couple of years ago, we were in China, we flew down for the event, and he pointed out that the more capable we become through our education and developing our talents, the better we're able to serve other people. And that is such a profound teaching. I mean, in one sense, it's obvious, but in another sense, very few people are doing it, using their education, their resources to benefit other people and humanity. Now, sure, there's lots of NGOs and so on that are doing that kind of work. But I think the Christian community in general seems to be fairly satisfied that they're going to church and they're good, And no, they should be out there working on the welfare farms. They should be out there doing rescues and environmental catastrophes. They should be out there helping people get educated. I mean, the Pathway program alone is phenomenal. And we have non-LDS people participating even in the group that we're in, and you don't have to be LDS or even part of the restoration to build Zion in those ways. And that's what I'm really enthusiastic about and most passionate about. In fact, just as I give you one last example, here in Oregon, they have a teacher shortage because they're having to cancel high school classes and stuff because they can't get teachers. So my wife said, well, we ought to be substitute teachers. And I'm thinking, it's the last thing I have time for, but I see there's a need. So we're doing that now. And once we get back from our next trip, we're going to be substitute teaching in the schools just to help out, as a community service. But to me, that's kind of part of building Zion, right? You're helping the kids get educated. And anything people can do to make the world a better place, even in their neighborhood, is building Zion.
Well, first of all, thanks for the kind words that you said about my program. I love you, Jonathan, and everything you're doing. I love having you on, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again soon. Sometime our paths will physically cross, I'm sure, soon. Thanks for coming on.
For having me, and it's been a pleasure as always. And we'll just see what happens in the future.
That's right. So,
Okay.
Did you have any final words you had to say? Because it looked like you're going to say something. Okay.
Just looking forward to seeing you sometime. Maybe I'll come out to Florida one of these days. So.
Awesome. All right. So, folks, I just want to thank you for joining us today. I just want to remind you to like and subscribe. Don't forget that we do have a Patreon. So those of you who would like to be monthly contributors to the program, please sign up with us on Patreon. And I'll try to remember to leave a link for Patreon on there. I've been forgetting to do that. You can reach me at mormonbookreviews@gmail.com. And don't forget that we're still working on the podcast, but about 80 of our videos are now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, as well as Google Podcasts. We're hoping to expand to a couple other platforms soon as well. Either way, you have yourself a great day and be well.